Here's something really neat. It's a 1932 National Triolian. It's got this fantastic spray-painted beach scene on the back to cure your Depression-era blues. I'm sure this thing has some stories to tell. It lost the original badge there. You can see at some point it had been set up with a higher nut for playing lap style. It's got the original spun aluminum cone and the original biscuit still attached to it. This is a replacement tailpiece. The customer asked me to cut it down so that the strings wouldn't be passing over the second hump, and that would give us a little bit more downward pressure on the bridge. These things only require about 6 or 7 degrees, but we were kind of pushing it there. And the nice thing about it is the action is great. It's actually sitting at about 6/64ths, which is just right for the person who now plays it. These are the original 85-year-old frets, and that's the main issue for us here today. I'm just going to put a micrometer on them here. And you can see that we're sitting at about 22 thousandths, 23 thousandths, which is pretty darn low. These have been redressed a good many times over their life. And there's not much material there to work with. There are some issues where the neck meets the body. Things are a little bit wavy up here, and it's noting out a little bit on the 12th and 11th frets on the lower strings. So I think after discussion with the owner, we've decided that it's time to do the deed. We're going to refret this guitar, and we're going to use a heavier wire than was originally put into the guitar, with the realization this is a working musician's instrument, and he expects to play it for a good long time. He owns a more modern National, and it's actually got jumbo frets in it, and he'd like this one to be set up in pretty much the same way. So that's what we're going to be doing, is a complete refret on this old guitar. The old board's got a lacquered surface here, so I want to be kind of careful with it. We're going to try and preserve as much of that as possible. Right now I'm just getting along the edges of the frets and cleaning up any schmutz that's caught up against the corner between the board and the fret surface, just so I can get my nippers under there and it's going to be clean. So this is going to be fun to film. I'm going to start off by using a soldering iron with a modified tip on it. I've ground a little half moon shape into it so that it seats nicely on the top of the frets, and I'll use that to apply some heat. And what that does is it gets in down into the fret slot. If there's any glue in there, it'll loosen it up, liquefy things, and any finger oils or stuff that's managed to seep in under the tang over the years lubricates everything and makes the fret pull out much easier. As you can see, I've already pulled a couple of previous frets out before I started the camera to make sure that things were going to go okay. I was a little bit concerned. I wasn't certain whether these were going to be bar frets or the standard T-shaped frets, but they are the standard ones, so no surprises. I apply heat for about a minute or so, and sometimes I will tape off around a fret, which will help control chip out from the barbs on the fret tang. Or I can also use a little piece of shim stock as well, just to hold down the surface of the wood on either side of the fret. Because this board has 85-year-old lacquer on it, the tape seemed like a bad idea because it would probably pull off a lot of that lacquer, and I want to preserve it. So we're going without the tape. I'm going to use my modified end nippers here. These are ground flush on the end, and they're rounded too, so that they apply pressure right down into the corner of the fret. I like the smaller size nippers for this job rather than the larger ones because, especially on a radius board, which this isn't, it lets you contact a smaller portion of the fret and makes it less likely to tear out fibers from the barbs. Go backwards and forwards a few times, gentle pressure, trying to support the wood directly under the portion of the fret tang that's lifting. So here we go. Comes out not too bad. That's remarkably clean. Let you have a look at this wire here. This is the old wire. You can see rather than triangular barbs that are pressed into the side of the wire, this stuff actually has a notch on the bottom. It was run through a die, like a little guillotine that went bop, 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 bop. So this, it seems like it's a slightly gentler way of making fret wire. And this came out really cleanly. I like that. I'm very happy with that. I checked the slot, and it's about 19 thousandths of an inch using a feeler gauge, which is nice. That means I'm not going to have to modify it too much to work with the modern frets that I have. I need to take these fret slots that are about 18 thousandths wide and size them up so they'll accept the tang on my larger fret wire to about maybe 23 thousandths is the current standard for fret slots. I could probably pound the frets in and they would go in, but this board would probably end up with a back bow, and this guitar has no truss rod, so there'd be no way to take that out. I could probably dress the frets down so that they'd be flat and level, but I think it's better to have them seated in correctly and not too much pressure on the board. I have to clean out the slots at any rate. I use a couple of tools for that. This is a little hooked scalpel blade, which helps me get in and peel up any glue or anything that's in there. I know that some of these frets, when I was taking them out, there was a little puff of smoke from the ends where someone had put in some, wicked in some super glue. Maybe the fret ends were coming up at some point. So I know there's a little bit of glue in the slot, so I'll clean them out with the hook tool. And then to resize, there are a couple of ways of doing it. I can get a Dremel tool with a little 23 thousandths bit and run them up and down. That works okay. But this is a low-tech way of doing it. This is a little scraper I made up from 23 thousandths thick feeler gauge stock. And what I can do is use it to scrape the fret slots and widen them. It'll take, 2 or 3 thousandths off the side walls and make them a consistent size all the way along. I have to sharpen it fairly frequently because it's spring steel rather than a high carbon steel, but it works pretty well. It's got a little hook edge, so I can use it either as a little bulldozer, or I can use it in a trailing motion as a scraper. Let's check and see whether the fret slot depth is okay. I'll put a feeler gauge into the slot, and I'll use a thin mechanical pencil to scribe a line. And it looks like they're pretty good. This is a piece of my fret wire, and I'll just butt that up against the feeler gauge, and it's probably impossible for you to see that, but it looks like I'm within maybe about a 64th of an inch, which is nice. Don't want them too deep. So I probably won't have to go any deeper. I'll check each slot as I go just to make sure there's not one or two that are too small for the fret wire. I'm using my fret tang nipper here to knock off the portion of the tang that lies over top of the binding strips on either side of the neck. You can use a file for that, or a little belt sander also works. This is the quickest way. This is a jumbo sized wire, and you can see that it's also been pre-radiused slightly to ensure that when it's hammered into the board here, the little barbs on either side of the fret tang will spread out slightly into the wood and make a good solid connection, a firm grip. I cut the fret itself so that it's just slightly oversized for that reason, and I don't want a whole lot of unsupported tang, so I cut back about a 1/16 of an inch on either side so that when that spreading action happens, the fret slot is filled from one side of the fret to the other. I do each fret before I start working, and I store them in the little block here so that they're all sequentially numbered and I know which fret goes where. Fretting commences here. I'm using some glue on the slot and the fret tang. This happens to be fish glue, which is nice stuff. It has all the working properties of
hot hide glue, except a much longer open time because you use it cold. So that gets into the fret slot and locks things in place, but it also gets very, very hard, and that aids in energy transfer from the strings back into the neck, theoretically giving you the best possible tone and volume, which generally isn't a problem when it comes to a resonator guitar. So I'm going to put that in place there. And use the hammer technique. I knock the ends first, making sure that things are well supported on a padded block. Get them started to seat, and then I hit slightly heavier directional blows. You see, I actually go kind of laterally at the same time that I'm pounding down, and that spreads the fret out. Stop for a second to clean up the squeeze out around the fret before seating it home with heavier blows. So I'm going to use the old-fashioned hammer technique here on the neck itself. Where the fingerboard crosses over on top of the body, I can't do that, especially on this National. It would be like pounding on the fender of a car. I'd probably dent it, and there just isn't enough support under that area. So I have to expand the fret slots and file off the little barbs that are on the tang of the frets, and I'll super glue them in place, hold them in place, wick some super glue under them individually. Normally I would clamp them, but it's just hard with the design of the National. There isn't enough space to get a clamp underneath the fingerboard extension. So here I am, laboriously filing off all the little tangs. Got a white piece of paper here so that I can see the fret filings, but it also gives me a good visual backdrop to tell when I get close to the edge of the neck. I don't want to touch the binding. Make sure things are nicely protected with both steel and cardboard. The binding on this guitar is kind of rounded over. There's not a whole lot of support at the end of the fret there, so I'm using some super glue on those areas to try to soften the transition. The player is quite concerned with keeping as much width as possible. Here's an old cast cast aluminum level that I flattened on a surface plate, and I use that for doing most of the leveling on my fret. You can see how uneven things are on the portion of the fingerboard over the body, mostly because there are a couple of screws underneath the pearl dots that hold the neck onto the body. Using my recrowning file here, and then rounding over the ends of the frets using a little safe edge file, trying to make them look like hot dogs. Just make them comfortable for the player. And then it's time to polish and make the frets shine. I thought I would edit this down, but then I realized, no, if I got to do this, you got to watch it. So there are 5 different grades of abrasive, from 400 grit up to 6,000 grit micro mesh abrasive pad. And when people talk about lutherie, this is one of the jobs they don't really envision. It's, you know, I spent about 35-40 minutes on a guitar fret job just making the frets polished. And it's a long way to go. You start to get sore fingers if you do more than 2 of these jobs in a week. Time to make a new nut because the old slots are much too low now. Marking things out very carefully with a pencil, which I'll cut back to the line and file it so that it fits nicely. This is half a pencil I've planed down. That indexes against the top of the frets and gives me a good solid line to work to when I'm roughing out the nut slots. I know I'll be safe if I go down to that line. This is a string spacing ruler to give me the correct spacing. And I'll use a little razor saw to give me starting points that are right on the mark.
You know, I almost always eat the cost of restringing, but for these little guys, Dobros and Nationals, the 3/8 inch, I gotta start charging more for this.
Using some gauge nut slotting files here. This is a back and forth process. You've got to sneak up on the marks slowly and carefully, taking some time to make sure everything feels good to the hand. And how do you make a new nut look old? You dunk it in a special mixture of instant coffee, orange pekoe tea, and a little bit of yellow turmeric powder, which is necessary because it gives it that slightly yellow undertone you see in old bone. No matter how careful you are when you put on the strings and things come up to tension, there are always a few spots that need a little bit of redressing. And there you have it, all strung up and ready to play. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again soon.